The static on the car radio cut out the moment the asphalt gave way to the gravel of Route 9. It wasn't the sudden silence that made me uneasy, but the way the pines seemed to crowd the shoulder, their lower branches completely stripped of needles, as if something massive had brushed past them. According to the map, the old ranger station was only a 2-mile hike from the trailhead, a straight shot through a dense but otherwise ordinary grid of timber. But 30 minutes into the trek, the familiar, comforting smells of damp earth and cedar vanished, replaced by the faint copper tang of old blood and the suffocating odor of stagnant water. I stopped to adjust my pack, and that was when the woods went entirely dead. There were no cicadas, no wind rustling the canopy, not even the low hum of distant highway traffic. I took a step forward, and a distinct, heavy crunch echoed from the brush directly to my left, mirroring my pace perfectly just half a second too late. When I froze, the sound stopped. I turned my flashlight toward the thicket, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a circle of 5 white pine trees. Nailed to each trunk, exactly 7 feet up, were worn leather work boots, positioned vertically as if the invisible bodies wearing them were dangling from the upper canopy. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound, like fingernails tapping against dry bark, began to drift down from the branches directly above me. I didn't look up. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my light fixed on the dangling boots. As I retreated, the clicking sound shifted, dropping effortlessly from the treetops to the forest floor, rapidly accelerating into the thudding stride of something heavy running on 2 legs. I broke into a full sprint toward the faint outline of the main road, the heavy footsteps tearing through the undergrowth right behind me, close enough that I could feel the air grow freezing cold against the back of my neck. The fog rolled in off the ridge so fast, it swallowed the trail markers before I could even reach for my compass. It wasn't a normal mist. It was thick, gray, and smelled faintly of scorched copper, clinging to the damp bark of the ancient hemlocks like a shroud. I decided to pitch my tent right there on the moss, desperate to get out of the damp cold that was settling deep into my bones. But as I pulled the rainfly taut, I noticed the silence. The evening breeze had completely died, leaving the woods so unnaturally still that the sound of my own shallow breathing felt like a violation of the peace. Around 3 a.m., a low, rhythmic vibration woke me, pulsing directly through the ground beneath my sleeping pad. It sounded like a massive, collective humming, dozens of human voices chanting a single, discordant note just below the threshold of hearing. I unzipped the tent flap an inch and peered out into the moonlit fog. Standing in a perfect perimeter around my campsite were the dark silhouettes of the forest's deer. There were at least 15 of them, completely motionless, but they weren't looking at my tent. They were all facing outward into the dark, their heads bowed low, their ears pinned back in absolute submission to whatever was approaching from the deep brush. Then the humming stopped, and the deer began to snap. One by one, with a series of wet splintering cracks, the animals' front legs bent backward at impossible angles as they forced themselves down onto the frozen earth, pinning their heads to the dirt. From the darkness beyond them came the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps, accompanied by a wet, scraping noise like a wet sack of flour being pulled over rocks. A towering shape, easily 8 feet tall and horribly gaunt, stepped into the faint circle of my flashlight's glow. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin that twitched and rippled as it began to mimic, in a perfect, flat cadence, the exact voice of my mother calling my name from the dark. The hunting cabin had been abandoned since the late 80s, but the heavy oak door was still unlocked, swinging open with a groan that seemed to echo across the valley. I had original plans to hike the ridge, but an unseasonal, freezing rain had forced me to seek shelter under its rotting roof. Inside, The air was heavy with the smell of wet wool and old soot. As I dropped my pack onto a dust-covered cot, I noticed a neat row of Polaroid photos lined up along the mantelpiece. Every single picture was a shot of the very cot I was looking at, taken from the exact same angle in the dead of night, each one showing a different traveler sleeping soundly beneath a threadbare wool blanket. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat against the wall with my tactical light in hand, watching the shadows stretch across the floorboards as the storm raged outside. Around midnight, the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the tin roof was abruptly cut through by a sharp metallic scratch from the floor directly beneath me. The cabin was built on short concrete stilts over a shallow crawl space, leaving just enough room for a person, or something else, to squeeze underneath. Slowly, the scratching moved, tracing the gaps between the floorboards, tracking my exact position on the floor until it stopped right beneath my boots. Then came the whistling. It wasn't a bird or the wind through the eaves. It was a low, breathy human tune vibrating the floorboards right under my feet. The melody was jarringly cheerful, a carnival tune that sounded flat and distorted in the dark. I held my breath, terrified that the slightest movement would signal I was awake. As the whistle reached a high, reedy crescendo, a pale, spindly finger with a split, blackened nail pushed up through a knothole in the wood, just inches from my left knee, waving slowly in the dark like a blind worm testing the air. The finger withdrew, and for a second, the cabin fell entirely silent again. Then, a heavy blow struck the floorboards from below, hard enough to splinter the wood and send a jolt through my spine. Another strike followed, then another, a frantic, violent hammering as whatever was in the crawl space began trying to break its way through the rotted wood from underneath. I grabbed my pack and threw myself out the cabin door into the freezing downpour, not daring to look back, even as a wet, desperate screech tore through the floorboards behind me, blending perfectly with the howling of the storm.